Hi there, I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, your one-stop shopping destination for the very best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. You can find us online at cruxnow.com, and a fellow at the Word on Fire Institute. Welcome to another edition of the John Allen Show, brought to you by the good people at Word on Fire. This week, as I do every week, I'm going to bring you the story and then the rest of the story. So the story is this. You know, James Joyce famously defined the Catholic Church as here comes everybody. The idea being that the Catholic Church, this 1.3 billion strong family of faith scattered in every nook and cranny of our planet, has a little bit of everything in it. And therefore, inevitably, the Catholic story is a mix of light and shadow, of bitter and sweet, of good news and bad. And mid-October 2019 seemed to capture all of that. There are three big storylines unfolding in the Vatican right now. One is the Synod of Bishops for the Amazon. Another was the canonization last Sunday of now Saint John Henry Newman. And a third is the unexpected firing of the chief of the Vatican Gendarmes, that's its major internal security service, an Italian layman by the name of Domenico Giani. Now, I am going to briefly sketch each one of those stories, and if you stick around, I will then unpack all of them for you in the rest of the story. Let's begin with the October 6th to the 27th Synod of Bishops on the Amazon. This was a summit of 184 bishops and other religious, plus 150 or so other participants from the Amazon. Summoned by Pope Francis 2 years ago, it got underway on October 6th, and it runs until October 27th. There is a staggering variety of themes being considered by this synod. They include ecology, how to defend the biome of the Amazon from a kind of slash and burn model of development that produced something on the order of 80,000 fires over the summer, and that are devastating to its ecology. The Amazon is home to about 10% of the world's known biodiversity. And so in keeping with the spirit of Pope Francis's environmental encyclical from 2015, Laudato Si, the defense of the environment in the Amazon has been a major theme. Of equal importance has been the indigenous cultures and peoples of the Amazon. There are roughly 400 indigenous communities in the Amazon. There has been a lot of conversation about how to overcome the legacy of colonialism, show greater respect to these cultures and peoples, and preserve their languages, preserve their rituals, preserve their identity. In Catholic terms, there has even been some conversation about the idea of an Amazon rite of the Mass. That is a unique ritual of the Mass that would reflect the religious language and rituals and sort of worldview of the Amazon. Another important theme has been women, the exploitation of women in the Amazon, but also the centrality of women in terms of transmitting the faith and keeping the work of the church going in the region. There has been talk about trying to find some way to recognize the contributions of women in ministerial terms. But, from a media point of view, undoubtedly the big picture question has been married priests. From the very beginning, there has been a sense that this synod might well endorse the idea of allowing greater permission for the ordination of married men to serve isolated rural communities in the Amazon that otherwise would not have access to the Eucharist. That indeed has proven to be the case. Every day in Vatican briefings, this subject comes up. The other day, retired Bishop Edwin Krautler of Brazil told us that 2/3 of the bishops in the hall support the idea. Now, of course, that hasn't been tested by any actual voting, but it is certainly the case that this is a dominant theme that will continue to loom large in discussions. So you have the Amazon Synod going on, but it took a pause last Sunday because Pope Francis canonized English Cardinal John Henry Newman, along with 4 women, in the same canonization ceremony. Newman was, of course, the most famous convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism in the 19th century. and was also one of the great Catholic theologians of his time. Ironically enough, claimed today by both left and right for various points in the church, which I suppose illustrates that his thought was supple and difficult to pigeonhole ideologically. And this canonization, therefore, has significance ecumenically in terms of immediately the relationship between Catholicism and the Anglican Communion, but more broadly, the relationship between Catholicism and all other branches of the divided Christian family. And it also has theological significance. Finally, this week saw the departure of the longtime commander of the Vatican Gendarmes, an Italian layman who started out with the Italian Secret Service and then came to work for the Vatican in 1999 as the vice commander of the Gendarmes, Domenico Giani. This occurred in the wake of the spectacular leak of a document prepared by Giani regarding the investigation of 5 Vatican officials who are suspected, though it has to be said, not yet charged, with financial improprieties, including the vice director of the Vatican's Financial Information Authority, which is its financial watchdog unit, the outfit that is supposed to write her and other people who are engaged in financial shenanigans. The document prepared by Giani, along with photos of the suspects, ended up in the Italian press. It got published. This apparently infuriated Pope Francis. And Giani was held responsible, and so he has been asked to resign. It's a kind of monumental moment because for a long time, Domenico Giani was thought of as the J. Edgar Hoover of the Vatican, the guy who just simply, to be honest with you, had too much dirt on too many people to ever lose his job. He was thought of as kind of untouchable. And the fact that he has had to resign over this affair obviously gives the lie to that idea. Optimists will tell you it creates an opening for reform. Pessimists will tell you, it is another chapter of the kind of power struggles and internal peccadillos within the Vatican for which it has been famous over the centuries. All right, that's the story. Please, after a moment, stick around for the rest of the story.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
All right, let us begin with the Amazon Synod. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this is a summit of bishops that was convened by Pope Francis in October 2017, so 2 years ago. And to be quite honest with you, when Pope Francis originally announced the idea of an entire Synod of bishops specifically focused on the Amazon, many of us in Rome were skeptical that this would be a particularly interesting exercise. The theory was, it would be of local interest for the 9 countries that contain some piece of the Amazon, but that would be about it. But as it has played out, it is anything but a snooze fest. It is, in many ways, a kind of litmus test, if you like, or the technical word here is synecdoche, a part that represents the whole for the entire papacy of Pope Francis. And it has generated controversy on multiple levels. Critics from the right of a more traditionalist or conservative bent are concerned that this synod is poised to endorse a kind of radical, secular, ecological agenda that has the potential to transform the Catholic Church from an essentially spiritual enterprise in the business of saving souls to an essentially secular NGO in the business of saving rainforests. Some are also concerned that there is a very uncritical embrace of indigenous cultures in the Amazon going on that could have the effect of reducing the impetus for evangelizing these people, that is, trying to bring them the Christian gospel and trying to lead them by an ever greater process into practice of the Christian faith. There are others who are concerned that this synod might end up sacrificing core principles of Catholic identity, such as the general requirement for celibacy for priests in the Latin Rite. Now, of course, in the media, this gets covered as a debate over married priests. It really isn't, because the truth of it is the Catholic Church already has married priests. The 23 Eastern Rite churches that are in full communion with Rome all have a married priesthood. Most of them follow the Orthodox custom that their rank and file clergy are married, and then their bishops are drawn from the ranks of the monastic orders who are celibate. But in any event, there are married priests. In the United States, there are hundreds of married Catholic priests. They are converts from the Episcopal Church or the Methodist Church or the Lutheran Church who were married before they converted, allowed to remain married when they were ordained as Catholic priests. So the debate here is not over whether the Catholic Church should have married priests. Really, the debate is over whether it should have more of them. And in particular, as a solution to severe priest shortages in isolated areas such as the Amazon. Over and over during this synod, we have heard stories from bishops and from missionary priests and from sisters serving in the Amazon and from ordinary lay people who will tell you that there are communities that are lucky, maybe to see a priest once a year at Christmas or at Easter, but not both. And so therefore they have the Eucharist only once a year. And the argument is that if we believe, as the Second Vatican Council taught, that the Eucharist is the source and summit of Catholic life, that is, it is the foundation. Regular reception of the Eucharist is the foundation of what it means to be Catholic. Then obviously that's a problem. And advocates of a married priesthood, and usually what they're arguing for are the so-called viri probati. That's a Latin phrase that means tested married men. The idea is we're talking about older guys who are pillars of their community, who are known to be good, church-going, moral guys, that they could be called into ministry in some form, whether it's priesthood in the most developed sense or it's a kind of trimmed down form of the priesthood, but in any event, that they could be called into ministry either permanently or temporarily, in order to be able to celebrate the sacrament of the Eucharist and bring it to the people. Now, those who are opposed to that idea will argue on various grounds. Some will argue for the spiritual value of celibacy, the idea of the total donation of oneself to Christ, as a critical sort of cornerstone of priestly identity in the Latin Church, and will say it should not be sacrificed for expediency's sake. Others will make a more practical argument that they're dubious that the mere fact of being able to ordain married priests will necessarily result in a bumper crop of new vocations. They would argue that other Christian churches have gone that route, the Anglican Communion being one of them, but certainly the Methodists and others as well. And they will say that it is not necessarily the case that in the Amazon, those other Christian confessions are generating ministers like gangbusters, and will say that actually what's needed is a deeper commitment to a culture of vocations rather than sort of amending the criteria for admission to the priesthood. That debate is in full flower during this synod, and it will no doubt continue to go on until the synod reaches a conclusion towards the end of this month. The last day of the synod is October 27th, and at that stage we expect to know what recommendations the 184 voting members of this synod, mostly bishops but also including some religious, we will know what recommendations they have put in front of Pope Francis. Things that seem more solid. There will be a strong call for the Church to commit itself to an ecological witness in defense of the environment in the Amazon, against deforestation and destruction of the natural habitat. There will be a strong call for greater solidarity among the various local churches in the Amazon. In fact, on Tuesday, at least one participant in the Synod recommended creating a bishops' conference for the Amazon that would be tied into the larger bishops' conference for Latin America, but that would promote relationships and common action in terms of pastoral work in the Amazon. There is likely also to be a strong call for a greater witness and commitment to indigenous peoples and cultures, and for a deeper enculturation of the Christian faith so that it penetrates those cultures. One idea that it probably will not be fleshed out during this Synod, but it may be put on the table for future discussion, is the idea of an Amazon rite of the Mass. This would be analogous in some ways to the Zaire rite of the Mass that was adopted in 1988. The bishops of what is today the Democratic Republic of Congo, after the Second Vatican Council in 1969, recommended creating a special rite of the Mass for sub-Saharan Africa. It was developed over the course of the next almost 20 years and finally issued in full form in 1988. So this would be a sort of companion idea. No doubt the role of women and the importance of giving value to the roles of women will be a strong note at the end of this Synod. Remains to be seen whether the Synod will explicitly endorse the idea of women deacons. That's an idea that Pope Francis himself floated in 2016 and has been under study ever since. But certainly it looks likely that the Synod is going to endorse giving some kind of formal ministerial role to women that would recognize the reality that they are often the frontline carriers of the faith in the region. So the Amazon Synod continues to make waves. It is a relatively harmonious affair internally, but externally, it certainly continues to generate question marks and debate and no small measure of consternation in some quarters. It should be said that there are also some left-wing voices in the Catholic Church who are upset that no women have the right to vote in this Synod, and we will no doubt be hearing from them. When the Synod actually begins to vote on things, they will begin making the point again that the voices of women, at least formally speaking, are not reflected in those ballots. All right, that's the Amazon Synod. Now, this past Sunday, October the 13th, we also had the canonization of John Henry Newman, Cardinal John Henry Newman, who was part of the Oxford movement in the Anglican Communion in the Church of England in the 19th century, which was in effect an attempt to re-Catholicize Anglicanism, recover elements of the deeper and broader tradition that he and his like-minded companions felt had been lost over the years. And in the course of making that effort, Newman personally, spiritually, and intellectually grew ever closer to the Church of Rome. He finally converted. Was a somewhat controversial figure, it has to be said. Legendarily clashed with some figures in the English Catholic hierarchy of his day. When the Second Vatican Council was summoned in 1870, Newman, although he accepted personally the dogma of papal infallibility, he was opposed to the public declaration of the dogma at that time. He felt it would be inopportune, it would have damaging ecumenical effects, it would be kind of misunderstood by the broader world, and it would sort of set the church back in its efforts to come to terms with modernity. That was not an especially popular position within officialdom. Certainly was not the position of Pope Pius IX, who wanted the dogma of papal infallibility proclaimed, and of course eventually got it. But with a transition in papacies, the election of Pope Leo XIII, who was himself a deep intellectual. Pope Leo XIII was famed, among other things, for spending his downtime in the Vatican gardens penning Latin poetry in hexameter and so on. He had a deep admiration for Cardinal Newman and what he represented, and so Cardinal Newman was made a cardinal. Probably the significance of this canonization right now is that this is the first contemporary saint for the Catholic Church in the UK. The UK today is one of the world's most thoroughly secular environments, and although there's not really anything you would consider explicitly violent religious persecution in the UK, I think it is probably fair to say that people of faith in the UK, and Catholics in particular, often feel a little beleaguered, a little put upon, and so having a contemporary saint is sort of an important point of pride for that community. Beyond that, it is also an important ecumenical signal. It's important to note that the Anglican Communion, the Church of England in particular, has welcomed the canonization of Newman and actually even celebrated the canonization themselves in their own ways. And it's also an important statement about Catholic theology. Cardinal John Henry Newman was an independent theological thinker, somebody who at times sort of swam against the tide, and yet he was able to carve out space for a kind of Catholic theology that was seen as innovative and ultimately as constructive and as moving the conversation forward. That, of course, is the role that theology has played over the centuries. We often say that the theological guild, in a way, is where the church does its thinking. There was probably no better example of that in the 19th century than John Henry Newman. And so his halo, in a sense, is therefore a testament to Catholic theology when it is carried out in a constructive spirit everywhere. Finally, we have the saga involving Domenico Giani. Domenico Giani has been, for a number of years, the commander of the Vatican gendarmes. Now, what the public typically knows in terms of Vatican security is the Swiss Guard, because those are the guys in the colorful uniforms with the halberds who are charged with protecting the Pope's personal security. However, inside the Vatican, the most important police force, the most important security presence is actually the gendarmes. They are the ones who protect the physical plant of the Vatican. They're also the ones who investigate alleged crime. And that has meant that Domenico Giani, for a very long span of time, has in effect been the Vatican's enforcer. He is the guy that a pope or a cardinal secretary of state would basically send after someone if they were suspected of doing something untoward. And Giani, who personally is a very sweet and gentle soul, but in a professional capacity, is a tough guy. And people who have been interrogated by Giani, will come out telling stories of how forceful and intimidating he could be in those settings. And so he was the guy that popes relied upon, basically, to crack heads when there was a perception that heads needed to be cracked. Now, inevitably, because this is the Vatican, Giani also, over the years, acquired, it should be said that questions were raised at times about whether Giani himself was always on the up and up. He was accused, for instance, of being involved in a shady deal involving rehabbing his personal apartment. I mean, actually, it's the apartment that belongs to the commander of the Swiss Guard, so it wasn't his personally, but of course it's where he lived. And the accusation was that money that was given to the gendarmes generally was funneled through the Vatican museums and then put back into an account. It was then paid out to finance some improvements to that apartment that had the net effect of giving Giani a significantly nicer place to live. It's analogous in a way of accusations that were made about Italian Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone and the pediatric hospital Bambino Gesù, and the idea that money was funneled through the Bambino Gesù to fix up Bertone's apartment. Two Vatican officials were convicted of financial impropriety in that affair. To date, nobody has been charged with anything with regard to Giani, but nevertheless, the accusations are out there. Giani has been involved in some of the least savory chapters of recent Vatican history by necessity. He was the guy who was put on the spot to try to deal with the two different Vati leaks messes, that is the leak of sensitive information, one cycle of which was under Benedict XVI, one under Pope Francis. He's also was the guy who was charged with dealing with the former Auditor General of the Vatican, Libero Malone, who was accused of by Giani, was accused of various forms of misconduct. He was fired over those accusations. Then later, the Vatican said that his case had been archived, that is, it had been set aside with no charges being filed, but there has been no rehabilitation of Malone, and he has, of course, not been returned to his previous position. So that's a kind of question mark. In any event, because Giani was the one with his finger on all of this sensitive information for so long, he was sort of seen as the Vatican's equivalent of J. Edgar Hoover, the legendary director of the FBI, and who served until he died in the 1970s under a succession of American presidents. There was never any question of firing Hoover, in part because, he was such an institution, he was synonymous with the FBI, but also in part because a lot of people felt that Hoover probably had files on all of these people, and then there was a kind of implicit threat that if anybody would make a move against Hoover, maybe those files would find the light of day. A lot of people assumed the same thing was probably true about Domenico Giani, but in the end, this most recent case in which 5 Vatican officials were suspended for suspicion of financial wrongdoing, and a document written by Giani detailing those suspensions along with pictures of the suspects ended up being leaked to the Vatican, or to the Italian press. It was published by a prominent Italian news magazine. According to reports, this just drove Pope Francis around the bend because, the Pope's concern is for protection of the reputations of people who perhaps are facing allegations but might not necessarily have done anything wrong. And in part, of course, is just he doesn't like to see confidential Vatican information being published in the Italian press. And so he apparently held Giani accountable for that. And although Giani was given a very soft exit, he was allowed to do an interview with the Vatican's official news channel in which he talked about his years of service and how he tried to carry them out in a spirit of self-denial and fidelity and so on. So it was a soft landing, but it was a landing nevertheless. I mean, basically he was given his walking papers, which shows that the impunity people thought Giani had clearly does not apply in the Pope Francis era. Now, what will be fascinating to track going forward is what Pope Francis does with the gendarmes from here. If he appoints somebody who has a reputation as a kind of clean hands figure, who is committed to real transparency, then that would obviously be seen as a significant blow for reform. If he goes back into kind of the same well that they got Giani from, that is hiring somebody from the Italian Secret Service who is a kind of murky or muddled record on those things, then that, of course, would lend itself to a different set of conclusions. I find myself wondering sometimes what the people who were in town this month for the Synod of Bishops for the Amazon, who were missionaries in the Amazon, right? Who are, they work in places where, they have to get into a canoe and paddle for like 9 hours in order to be able to say Mass or something. And they're doing it, of course, in the name of the gospel. What they must make of this kind of palace intrigue that is unfolding at the same time that they're here in Rome for the Synod. But, the truth of it is, if the Vatican didn't exist, we would have to invent it. The Catholic Church is a far-flung and highly complex global enterprise. It needs some kind of central administrative bureaucracy. And whenever you have bureaucracies made up of human beings, you are likely to have the kind of situation that we have seen playing out this week around Domenico Giani. It's not to say that reform is impossible or that things cannot be improved, but it is to say that the sort of perfect world that people sometimes seem to think that the Vatican ought to be probably is not meant to be, at least in this order of existence. All right, that's the story from Rome for mid-October 2019. Thank you for watching The John Allen Show. Please continue checking in with the Word on Fire Institute for all of its fascinating programming and materials. Please keep reading Crux online at cruxnow.com. That is cruxnow.com. And until next time, have a fantastic and blessed time.